Okay, so after the protests of what's now known as the Yellow Vest movement in France, so early in December, the French government decided that they wouldn't go ahead with a fuel tax, which was
tell us, recap just what happened with the protests, because I don't know if everyone has followed that itself. Certainly in the U.S., not everyone has followed it.
Okay. So earlier in 2018, the French government announced that it would add some fuel tax to gasoline and diesel in France in order to decrease the oil demand, which is part of the long-term plan of the French government to reduce CO2 emissions. And that sparked some large-scale protests across France, particularly in France.
And, in Paris, you mean?
In Paris, yeah. Sorry. And the Yellow Vest movement got its name from the high-visibility yellow vest that every driver in France has to take with them in their car in case of an emergency. So everyone had one. That was probably useful. So these went on for several days and weeks and got a lot of attention in the media, and thousands of protesters over a lengthy time period blocked traffic, and part of it actually got a little violent. I think 4 people died. But so the result of that was that finally the French government took down the proposal to add the tax to gasoline and diesel, which was around 10 to 30 cents on the gallon, if I translate that correctly to American money and volume.
Yeah, so that in the U.S. that's definitely considered significant, but maybe you're planning on talking about this, but just part of the context that I see for this story is you have, Paris, interestingly, as the site of the Paris Climate Accords, which are just considered the absolute moral paragon guidelines for the way the world should be proceeding in terms of radically reducing CO2 emissions. So in terms of this fuel tax that was meeting a lot of opposition because it was clearly harming people, would this fuel tax by itself, how close did this bring France, or would this have brought France to meeting its Paris Climate Accord obligations?
So you have to remember that in Europe in general, the fuel prices are significantly higher than in North America. So this would have added something like 10-15% or so, I believe, to the fuel price, which is significant, but it would probably not discourage everyone from driving to work. So it wouldn't even help with the CO2 emissions from transportation on its own. And yet not everyone, but many French drivers noticed that this would be an enormous economic burden on them for little gain.
So then, what does this tell us? So I'm curious if you agree with me, but my basic read is that people in Paris being that's the city that's most associated now with radical reductions in CO2 emissions, this is being promoted in line with our first story, at least the reference to the people who are saying, oh, intermittent energy is just as cheap or cheaper. People are saying, oh, there's no problem meeting these targets because actually solar and wind are pretty much cheaper, and it's just, we're just a little bit backward and we're a little bit slow. But if we can get a nice kick from a Paris Climate Accords or an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'll talk about her proposals later, then we'll be fine. So we'll have cheap, plentiful, reliable, and renewable energy, and then everything will be great. And yet here, a tiny step in that direction is actually causing obvious suffering. So what do you make of that?
Well, let me jump in here for a second because I had a thought on that, which is, there's this whole narrative that we're going to have all of these climate restrictions inevitably, and that therefore, we're going to talk about, when we get to the divestment movement, the idea that all of the assets, owned by oil and gas and coal companies are going to stay under the ground and are going to be valueless. But at least in this instance, and in other instances, there's a whole debate in Canada and in Australia, when people really directly experience the costs of these climate restrictions, they're not politically feasible, even in places that regard it as vitally important to, quote, oppose climate change. And so virtually every kind of future assessment about the inevitability of these climate restrictions, I think, is at least thrown into question. And I think that one thing that it is doing is it's informing the kind of strategies that the green movement and that climate activists are proposing. And so, when we talk about the Green New Deal, I think part of why that's so popular is that it's a recognition that when people are faced with taxes in the name of fighting climate, and like individuals are facing those taxes directly, and they can measure them in the context of their lives, what it'll mean for my gas bill each week in order to, quote, fight climate, people do not like it, and it's not politically realistic, and it's not politically popular.
Steffen, I want to jump into divestment, but Steffen, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in addition to my fact research, I also have to read a lot of commentary, and what you get from activists who are promoting this kind of policy is it's a matter of political will. The technology is there, we can do it, we might actually save some money on the energy, and then it's just a matter of political will. And so the drivers of France tend to disagree, is what I take from it.
Yeah, and so this is another, just one final thought on this is just one of infinite reasons why it's good to have a free society where people have to prove their economic ideas instead of imposing them on you, because it's very easy to predict that, oh yeah, of course, if we just mandate 100% solar and wind or 50% solar and wind, it'll all work out. But things usually don't work out. Most predictions are wrong. Either they're totally wrong. They sometimes the thing is just totally unworkable, or sometimes it's 2 to 3 times more expensive. And when that's somebody's private idea, then just they and their investors lose the money, and maybe they learn something, and it's not that bad. But when it's forced on us, then if we're forced to use the inferior thing, then that's really deadly. And then we're talking about something really deadly with the fundamental area of our economy, which is energy.